No matter what programming language or framework you use, there are always some files that we don't want to be in the Git repository, like files that are generated during the build process, or log files, or editor configuration files. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to make Git ignore them. Okay, there are several ways to ignore files and directories. The most common way is to use a file named .gitignore. And it's not a private file, so you should create it by yourself. You can either put it in the root directory of your project or any other directories that are in your project directory. The second way is to create a global ignore file somewhere on your machine and tell Git to use that as a global ignore file. Another way to ignore files and directories is to edit the local ignore file configuration in the .git directory. Yes, that's right. There is also a file for that in the .git directory, and I'm going to show that to you in just a bit. But there are also two other ways to ignore files in Git, and they're a bit different than other ways. Using them, you can ignore your changes in your tracked files by telling it to not check for their changes. And there are two commands for that, for two different purposes, and we'll talk about both later. But for now, let's start with the most common way to ignore files in Git. So let's first create a directory. So cd/temp, I'm gonna do the stuff that I'm going to do in the temp directory, but you can choose whatever directory you want. Then make directory test. Let's go there, so cd test. And let's make it a git directory, so git -b main. Then let's add some files here, to make it look like a real project. So make directory source logs build, and then touch main.js, source foo.js, logs, log1, log2, log3, and build index.html. Okay, that's enough. Now let's create a .gitignore file. So touch .gitignore. Now, if I open the whole directory using VS Code, so code dot, as you see, VS Code gave it a Git icon because it's a Git file. So let's ignore some files and directories here. You can create comments here by adding the hash sign at the beginning of the line, like hash sign directories. Then add the directories you want to ignore here, like logs / build / you can use patterns here too, like everything that ends with .log. Okay, what if we want all our log files ignored except log number 3? We can create exceptions like ignore all log files except !logs log number 3. But for this to actually work, we need to ignore all of the files in the logs directory, not only the logs directory. And for that, just put an asterisk after a slash. So logs /asterisk. Okay, there are also some places that you can get a gitignore template according to the technology you use. I will put their links in the description so you can check there. Now if I check the status, so git status. Now the only stuff we can add to the staging area is the source directory and the main.js file, and of course the .gitignore file. So the cost of ignoring files with the gitignore file is to add the gitignore file to the Git repository, which is not bad at all, but it means that you need to add only the stuff that all of the team members want to ignore, because it's going to be in the Git repository, so it shouldn't be something that only you need to ignore. Okay, now let's add the ignore file to the staging area. So git add .gitignore. Now it's added to the staging area, but there are ways to ignore files only for you on your machine. Like you can have a global ignore file on your machine. How? Just create a .gitignore file somewhere on your machine, like somewhere global, like your user's home directory. So code /.gitignore. Okay, now we need something to ignore here, but something that is especially for our machine, like DSSOR files. You probably know what are those files if you have a Mac machine, so we can add that here. So .ds_store, then we need to tell Git to consider this file as a global gitignore. So git config -global core.excludes file /gitignore. Let's think another situation. What if you want some files to ignore but only for us? So we don't want to put it in the Git repository, and we also want it only for a specific project, like for example the foo.js file we have here. So in these situations, we can use the exclude file we have in the .git directory. Look, code.git info exclude. Okay, so I can just add source foo.js and save and close. Done. Okay, now you may feel a bit confused which files are ignored and which files are not. Well, we can check which files are ignored. Just type git status --ignore. And to see the actual files, we can type git status -ignored -untracked files equals all. There's also a command for checking if a file is ignored or not. Type git check ignore main.js and log number 2. And as the output is showing us, only the log number 2 is ignored between the main.js and log number 2. Git ls-files shows us what files are tracked by Git. With --others, we can see other files that Git doesn't care about, like untracked files or ignored files. Okay, what if we've saved a file to the Git repository before, but we need to change it for ourselves locally, but we don't want Git to annoy us, so we can tell Git to stop tracking this file like this. First, let's add the main.js file to the staging area. So git add main.js. Okay, now let's add something to this file. So code main.js, console.log hello world. Okay, let's check the status. So git status. Okay, it's modified as we've expected. But we can tell Git to don't care about what's happening for main.js in the working tree. Look, git update -index skip work tree main.js. Now if I check the status, so git status, wow, real magic does exist, huh? Okay, how can we set it back to normal? Well, to undo this command, type git update index no skip work tree and main.js. And that's it. Now git status, as you see, it's normally tracked and modified. But this was for times that we want to change a file, but we don't want to save the changes in the repository. What if we don't want to change a file? Imagine you have a giant project with lots of files in it, and for the performance, we can tell Git to don't waste the sources we have on the files that we don't plan to touch. So we can do like this: git update index --assume unchange main.js and git status. Okay, so the assume unchanged and the skip work tree commands are kind of the same, but they've been built for different purposes. One tells Git that we don't touch the file, so ignore the changes, and the other tells Git, hey, we are going to change this file a lot, so just ignore it as long as I tell you to track it again. And we can undo the assume unchanged command just like we did with the skip work tree command. Look, git update index --no assume unchanged main.js. Okay, now imagine that you already committed a file to the Git repository as we did with the main.js file, but now we've decided to ignore it. So this standard way is to remove it from the staging area, because if you committed a file to the Git repository, you probably have a copy of that file in your staging area, so you need to remove it first. So code.gitignore and main.js here. Okay, now let's remove this file from the staging area. So git rm -cached main.js. Okay, add -f. So git rm -f -cached main.js, and after you've added the main.js file to the ignored files, we can add gitignore file to the staging area, then commit it. But just like we may want to ignore some files that we've tracked before, we may want to track a file that is usually ignored. We can do that by forcing the add operation, like git add -f logs log number 2. Okay, now if I check the status again, it's been added to the staging area, but we can also check the ls-files command. Look, git ls-files-s. Okay, these are the files we have in the staging area. Now we can clean our working tree from the ignored files, like git clean -X to remove only the ignored files, D to also remove directories, not just files, and N to simulate the operation. Git clean -X, with normal X you can remove both untracked and ignored files. Okay, these files will be removed, and to actually remove them, type git clean -xd. Okay, ls to list this directory. That's it. Now we have a clean working tree. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.